I still remember the exact moment the piece of my ranch started to crack, and it began with a woman standing outside my gate holding a clipboard like she owned the entire county. At the time, I didn't think much of it. My ranch had been quiet for years. Thousands of acres of open land, the sound of wind through the fields, cattle moving slowly across the pasture, and mornings so calm you could hear coyotes miles away. That's the kind of life I chose on purpose. No crowded neighborhoods, no drama, just land, work, and peace. But everything started changing the year a new housing development appeared along the far side of my property line. At first, it was just construction trucks and survey flags. Then roads were paved, houses started popping up one after another, and suddenly a place that used to be open farmland was filled with rows of identical homes. I figured it wouldn't affect me much. After all, my ranch had been here for decades before that neighborhood ever existed. Then the HOA arrived. One afternoon, I saw a woman standing outside my ranch gate wearing sunglasses and holding a thick stack of papers. She looked irritated, like someone who had already decided she didn't like what she was seeing. The moment I drove up, she waved me down like I was being pulled over by traffic police. "Are you the property owner?" she asked. I said yes. That's when she introduced herself as the president of the neighborhood HOA. She didn't start with a greeting or a friendly conversation. Instead, she immediately began listing complaints. According to her, my ranch created visual problems for the new community. The fences were too rough looking. The tractors were too loud in the mornings. The livestock smell carried toward the houses when the wind shifted. I stood there trying to understand why any of this mattered. Then she said something that made me realize exactly what kind of situation this was going to be. "Well," she said confidently, tapping her clipboard, "you're going to need to start following HOA community standards." I almost laughed. I calmly explained that my ranch was private land and had absolutely nothing to do with their homeowners association. The neighborhood was built next to my property, not the other way around. But the look on her face told me she didn't like hearing the word no. That was the first moment I realized something important. Karen wasn't just introducing herself. She was declaring war on land she didn't control. For a while, I thought that strange conversation at the gate would be the end of it. I figured once the HOA president realized my ranch had nothing to do with their neighborhood rules, she would move on and focus on the people who actually lived inside her community. But I was very wrong, because about 2 weeks later, the letters started arriving. The first one showed up in my mailbox early Monday morning. It looked official, HOA letterhead, bold red text across the top, and a long list of violations typed underneath. According to the letter, my property had been reported multiple times for breaking community standards. They claimed my fences were unsightly, my equipment storage was visible from the neighborhood road, and my livestock operations were creating environmental disturbances. I read the letter twice before realizing something ridiculous. They had actually issued me a fine, not a warning, not a request, a fine. $50 per day until the issues were corrected. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe they accidentally mailed the notice to the wrong address. So I drove down to the HOA office located at the entrance of their neighborhood to clear things up. Karen was sitting behind a desk when I walked in, flipping through a binder full of paperwork. The moment she saw me, she smiled in that way people do when they believe they're about to win an argument. "Ah," she said, leaning back in her chair. "I was wondering when you'd come talk about your violations." I calmly explained again that my ranch was private agricultural land and had existed long before the neighborhood. I even showed her the county property map on my phone proving my land wasn't part of their HOA. She didn't even look at it. Instead, she slid another paper across the desk toward me. "Your land borders our community," she said firmly, "which means your property impacts our residents. Therefore, you will comply with HOA appearance standards." I stared at the paper for a moment before realizing something. She wasn't confused. She genuinely believed she had authority over land she didn't own. I left the office without arguing further. There was no point debating someone who had already convinced herself she was in charge. But over the next month, things escalated quickly. More letters arrived. Larger fines were listed. Some even threatened further action. If I didn't comply, that's when I started noticing something else. Karen wasn't just sending letters. She had started driving past my ranch almost every day watching my property like she was waiting for something to happen. At first, I ignored the letters, I ignored the fines, and I ignored Karen slowly turning my ranch into her personal surveillance project. But the situation changed the morning she brought the county into it. It was just after sunrise when I noticed 2 trucks parked near the entrance of my property. One of them had a county logo on the door, and the other belonged to a utility inspection company. That alone was strange. No one from the county ever showed up at my ranch without calling first. Then I saw Karen standing there with them. She looked way too pleased with herself. I drove my truck down the dirt road toward the gate and stepped out to see what was going on. The county inspector introduced himself and explained they had received a complaint regarding unauthorized water usage and infrastructure violations connected to my ranch. That sentence alone made no sense. My ranch had its own private well system that had been operating legally for years. It had been inspected and approved long before the housing development ever existed. So I asked the obvious question: who filed the complaint? The inspector glanced over his shoulder. Karen raised her hand slightly and gave me a small wave like we were neighbors greeting each other at a barbecue. She did, the inspector said. Karen immediately stepped forward with that same clipboard she always carried. "I've been monitoring this property," she said confidently, "and the water supply from his land may be affecting the pressure levels for our community." I blinked once, trying to process what she had just claimed. My ranch well had absolutely nothing to do with the suburban water system built for their neighborhood. They were completely separate systems. Even the inspector seemed confused. He walked over to the well equipment and quickly confirmed what I already knew. The system was private, legal, and had no connection to the neighborhood supply lines. Case closed. But Karen didn't look satisfied. Instead, she crossed her arms and said something that made the entire situation even stranger. "Well, if his water system is private," she said, "then he shouldn't have any problem shutting it off temporarily while we investigate further." I looked at her for a moment. Then I shrugged. "Fine," I said. I walked over to the control valve beside the well pump and shut the water system off completely. The entire ranch water supply stopped right there. No irrigation, no livestock troughs. Nothing. Karen watched the whole thing happen, and the moment the pump went silent, a slow smile spread across her face. At the time, I didn't realize why. But about 30 minutes later, I was about to find out exactly what kind of trap she thought she had just set. About 30 minutes after I shut off the water system, I was back in the barn checking on some equipment when I heard sirens coming down the road. At first I assumed it was just an ambulance heading toward the highway like they sometimes do. But the sound kept getting closer, and then it stopped right outside my ranch gate. When I stepped outside, I saw 2 sheriff's patrol vehicles parked at the entrance, and standing right beside them was Karen. She was talking rapidly to the deputies pointing toward my property like she had just uncovered some kind of major crime scene. Even from a distance, I could see the dramatic hand gestures and the exaggerated expressions. It looked less like a conversation and more like someone pitching a story. I walked down the dirt road toward the gate. Roadie guessing exactly who had called them. One of the deputies stepped forward when I got closer. "Sir," he said calmly, "we received a 911 call reporting illegal interference with a shared water supply affecting a residential neighborhood." For a second, I just stared at him. Then, I slowly looked over at Karen. She was standing there with her arms crossed, watching me with that same confident smile she always wore when she thought she was about to win. "He shut off the water," she said loudly, making sure the deputies heard every word. "My entire community just lost pressure. That's over 100 homes, families, children." The deputies exchanged a quick glance. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the accusation was so ridiculous it almost sounded like a joke. "My ranch well isn't connected to your neighborhood water system," I said calmly. "It never has been." Karen immediately shook her head. "That's not what we were told during construction," she insisted. "This land has always supplied water to the surrounding area." The deputies looked back at me, waiting for an explanation. So I pointed toward the well equipment behind me. "That system supplies water to my ranch," I said. "Livestock, irrigation, and the house. That's it." One of the deputies radioed someone from the county utilities department to verify the claim. While we waited, Karen kept talking, repeating the same accusation again and again, insisting that I had intentionally cut off water to punish the neighborhood for reporting me. But the strange part wasn't what she was saying. It was how confident she sounded, like she truly believed she had just caught me committing a crime. About 10 minutes later, the deputy's radio crackled with a response from county utilities. He listened quietly, then slowly lowered the radio, and the look on his face, Chan, Ged, because whatever he had just heard clearly wasn't what Karen expected. But the real shock was still coming, and it was about to make this entire situation a lot more complicated than anyone standing at that gate realized. The deputy stood there for a moment after the radio call, staring at the ground like he was replaying the message in his head. Karen, on the other hand, looked impatient. She kept glancing between me and the officers, clearly expecting them to start putting handcuffs on me at any second. Finally, the deputy looked up. "Ma'am," he said slowly, turning toward Karen, "County utilities confirmed that the neighborhood water supply is not connected to this property." For a brief moment, Karen's confident expression froze. "But that's impossible," she said quickly. "Our construction documents clearly show water access coming from this direction." The deputy shrugged slightly. "According to the county system maps, your neighborhood is connected to the municipal pipeline about 2 miles east of here. I could see the shift happening right there." Karen's certainty started cracking, but instead of backing down, she doubled down harder. "That map must be outdated," she insisted, because the moment he shut off his water, several homes reported low pressure. The deputy frowned. Now that part actually caught his attention. "Low pressure," he repeated. Karen nodded eagerly. "Exactly. People started messaging our HOA group chat immediately. The deputies exchanged another look, and this time they asked a different question. "Sir," one of them said to me, "how long has your well been supplying water to this ranch?" "Almost 30 years, I answered. "Same system, same pipes." The deputy nodded slowly, clearly trying to piece the situation together. Then he asked something that seemed small at the time, but turned out to be very important. "Do you happen to know if any underground lines from your well run past the property boundary?" I thought about that for a second. "Not that I'm aware of," I said, "but the well house and main pump station were built long before that neighborhood existed." Karen immediately jumped in again. "Exactly," she said, pointing toward my land, "which means the development may have been connected to it when they built the homes." Now the deputies looked genuinely curious, because if that were true, it meant something very strange had happened during the construction of the neighborhood. One of the deputies stepped aside and called county utilities again, this time asking for detailed infrastructure records. The conversation lasted several minutes. While we waited, Karen stood there with that same stubborn expression, convinced this was still somehow going to prove she was right. But when the deputy finally hung up the phone, his expression had completely changed. He walked back toward us, slowly, and said something that made the entire situation take a very serious turn. Apparently, he said carefully, "There are water lines running from this well toward the neighborhood." Karen's smile returned instantly. But the deputy hadn't finished speaking yet, and according to the records, those lines were never legally approved. The moment the deputy said those words, the entire mood at the ranch gate changed. Karen's confident smile came back instantly, like someone who thought the final piece of evidence had just landed in her favor. She crossed her arms and looked straight at me, clearly expecting the deputies to start treating me like the criminal she had been describing for weeks. "So there it is," she said loudly. "Illegal water distribution. Exactly what I reported." But the deputy didn't move toward me. Instead, he looked confused. "Ma'am," he said slowly. "Two. That's not what I meant." Karen's smile faded slightly. The deputy continued explaining what county utilities had just told him. Decades ago, long before the neighborhood existed, my ranch well had been registered as a private agricultural system. It supplied water only to the ranch structures and livestock areas. However, when the housing development was built nearby, something unusual happened. During construction, contractors apparently connected several temporary water lines to the closest available source while building the homes, and the closest water source back then, my well. Normally, those temporary connections are removed once the city installs the official municipal water line. But according to county utilities, the record suggested something very different happened here. Some of those lines were never disconnected, which meant a portion of the neighborhood had unknowingly been receiving water pressure influenced by my private system for years. The deputy looked directly at Karen, and based on what utilities just told me, he added, the developer never received legal permission from the property owner to use that well. Karen blinked, once, then twice. That can't be right, she said quickly. Our entire community has been here for years. The deputy nodded. That's exactly why the county wants to investigate it. For the first time since this whole mess started, Karen looked unsure of herself. Her entire argument had been that I was interfering with their water supply. But now the situation looked very different. If the neighborhood had been using water connected to my private well without authorization, then the problem wasn't me shutting off my system. The problem was that someone had built an entire development relying on infrastructure they didn't legally control. Karen opened her mouth to argue again, but before she could say anything, the deputy's radio crackled once more. County utilities had another update, and this time the message made the situation go from strange to extremely serious. Because the developer who built that neighborhood had filed documents claiming the water connection had been approved by the landowner, there was only one problem with that claim: I had never signed anything. The next morning, I woke up with a mix of anticipation and calm. Something felt different. Like the tension in the air had shifted. All week, Karen had been relentless, calling neighbors, filing complaints, and painting me as some rogue rancher disrupting her perfect little kingdom. But today, the pieces were finally aligning in my favor. I stepped outside onto the porch and looked across my pastures, sunlight glinting off the fences, and realized this was going to be the showdown that would end it all. By the time I arrived at the neighborhood meeting, the room was buzzing like a beehive. News vans lined the street, curious residents whispered nervously to one another, and the sense of anticipation was almost tangible. Everyone there had seen the signs of Karen's reign of terror, but no one had fully grasped the scale of her manipulation. I had 4K footage meticulously collected over months, showing every call, every false report, every attempt to turn the law against me. And now, all of it would be revealed. Karen arrived fashionably late, exuding the same confidence she'd wielded for months. High heels clicking, perfume cutting through the air, she entered as if the room belonged to her. Behind her, her entourage of private security and a photographer followed, a display of power she clearly thought would intimidate me. Little did she know, the real power today belonged to Truth, and it was about to hit her like a tidal wave. Commissioner Walsh began the meeting with routine formality. Ties, community awards, polite applause, but I knew everyone was on edge. When it was my turn, I approached the projector with a calm that belied the adrenaline rushing through my veins. I think the community deserves to see the complete picture of Whispering Oaks water management, I said, my voice steady but commanding as I clicked play. Footage of Karen orchestrating false reports, coordinating harassment, and lying about conservation measures filled the screen. Gasps rippled through the audience as her perfectly curated image began to crumble before their eyes. Each clip added a new layer of evidence, proving beyond doubt that her claims were fraudulent. Audio of her calls, documents she had forged, and visual proof of misappropriated water usage painted a damning portrait. Residents whispered to one another, connecting the dots for the first time. The polite applause from earlier turned into murmurs of disbelief. Karen tried to interrupt, but it was too late. Federal agents already in the room were prepared. When Agent Rodriguez stepped forward and announced her arrest for federal fraud, conspiracy, and harassment of a veteran, the room went silent. The sound of handcuffs clicking echoed like music, marking the end of her reign of terror. The aftermath was surreal. Brad Thornfield was also arrested for related conspiracies, and news crews captured every second. The Whispering Oaks HOA dissolved within weeks, property values rose, and the community began to heal. My ranch, once a battleground, became a teaching site for water rights and veteran protection. The sweet satisfaction of justice served, combined with the transformation of my land into a beacon of community and education, was more rewarding than I had ever imagined. In the end, patience, planning, and meticulous documentation turned months of harassment into a story of triumph, proving that standing your ground with integrity and evidence can topple even the most entitled oppressors.